Good afternoon, and welcome to us, past, present, and future. I'm Hope Wright, and I will be your moderator today. Today, we are going to talk about education. What is its purpose? What power does it have? And who is able to influence it? We're going to talk about what education is and what it means. But before that, we're going to start with the working definition coming from the Oxford English Dictionary. Education is the process of bringing up, the manner in which a young person was brought up, with reference to social station, kind of manners and habits acquired, calling or employment prepared for, etc. Joining us today to look at education through the lens of 18th century Williamsburg's Bray School are three panelists who are all in their own ways, both historians and educators: Nicole Brown, Deborah Canty Downs, and Dr. Julie Richter. I'll ask each one of you to introduce yourselves and to say a little bit about your connection to education in the Bray School.
Good afternoon. My name is Nicole Brown, and normally if you see me in Williamsburg, I don't look anything like this. Usually I'm in costume because I am a character interpreter and I portray Anne Wager, who was the teacher of the Williamsburg Bray School for its 14-year run. In addition to that, I am also in the master's program in the American Studies Department at William & Mary, completing my graduate coursework on research on the Bray School. And as of this week, I am now the assistant to the director of the Bray School Lab, which is a collaborative initiative that was started by William & Mary to do research on the Williamsburg Bray School and other similar topics.
Good afternoon. My name is Deborah Canty Downs. I have been working with Colonial Williamsburg since 1996. I started in School and Group Services, and I've worked my way into the education field. I am now employed by Newport News Public Schools at Katherine Johnson Elementary School, where I have started my 9th year teaching. My connection to the Bray School is talking about how the past influences the future of our education, to give our students an opportunity to see where they came from so they can chart the course for where they are going.
Hi, I'm Julie Richter. I'm the director of the National Institute of American History and Democracy at William & Mary, known in short as NIAD. It's a cooperative program between William & Mary and Colonial Williamsburg, where we operate classes for high school students who can earn college credit, and students at William & Mary focusing on public history and material culture. And I've been fascinated by the Bray School for many years, dating back to when I was a historian in the Historical Research Department at Colonial Williamsburg, learning about the students, learning about how their lives shaped where they lived in Williamsburg, what the education might have meant for them, and how this school helps us learn a little bit more about how the institution of slavery shaped Williamsburg as a whole. And it's just exciting to build on the work of earlier historians at Colonial Williamsburg and add new information that is learned through archaeology and dendrochronology and architectural research.
Well, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for joining us today. And for those of you that are watching, please remember you can post any questions that you do have to the chat. But to get us started, let's talk a little bit about the Bray School. First, just what was the Bray School?
So the Bray School was the first official school for African Americans or Afro-Virginians, as they might have been known in the 18th century. When I say first official school, I should qualify that, though. Black communities were certainly educating themselves before, during, and after the run of the Bray School. But as an official school with a building dedicated to itself, that's what I mean by official school. So it opened in 1760 in Williamsburg, and then it closed in the summer of 1774. So it ran for 14 years, closing when the teacher, Mrs. Wager, passed away. At the school, they taught reading, writing, sewing, and knitting. Half the students were girls over the lists that we have. Lessons in etiquette, and of course, they taught the doctrines of Virginia's official church at that time, the Church of England. Because the Church of England was not only the established church, but also the Bray Associates, for which the name the Bray School came from, they funded that charity.
So this is a place where free and enslaved Black children could go to learn?
Yes, yes. So the schools in Williamsburg, and again, I mean schools that have official funding, official buildings. If you're not going to be apprenticed to a trade or going to be having a private tutor or tutoress, then you have schools that are segregated both on class and race, as well as sometimes gender. And the Bray School was where students of African descent would attend, free or enslaved. Although that dynamic, I think, is interesting in Williamsburg when you look at the students who were enslaved, sometimes were also related to the students who were free. And that connection within the city and the interconnection between free Black communities and enslaved communities is definitely apparent when you look at the lists of students at the Bray School.
So it's likely for the enslaved children that were attending the school, they were being sent by an owner, a master, or a mistress. But for the free Black children, it was their parent or guardian who was choosing to send them.
Right, yeah.
Okay.
So you have, with the free Black families that we know of, you have the Ashby family who went to the school, so Matthew Ashby, and then later his wife, Anne Ashby, who is emancipated by her husband. They send their children, Mary, John, and Harry. And then the Jones family, who still live in this area, sent Mary Ann and Alicia Jones. And then you have the B family, but that portion of the family that goes to the school is actually enslaved and not free. So again, that speaks to sort of the complexities of who is sending the student to the school, the motivations as to why, and then how that student is interacting with those motivations, right?
Now, you talked about what students were learning at the Bray School. Today, when we think of schools in the 21st century, we think of curriculums and a syllabus and textbooks. Was there anything like that or something comparable at the Bray School?
There was, although from my understanding, how people utilize those textbooks is just as fraught as how people utilize textbooks today in the classroom. So to be abundantly clear, the Bray School was a pro-slavery institution. So the Church of England was very pro-slavery at this point in time, and actually pro-slavery until slavery was abolished in the United Kingdom in the 1830s. So the textbooks definitely reflect that. You have Bacon's Sermons to Slaves and Slave Owners, which was written in the 1750s by a minister from Maryland. The Church of England really liked using that textbook. The spelling textbook that was used at the school was called Dixon's English Instructor. It was a very popular textbook for Church of England institutions in general. And it was in its 24th publication at that point. And so again, it was a really popular textbook used all up and down British North America and in England. But the first 10 pages, of course, the alphabet, consonants, spelling, basic monosyllabic words. They actually break down, parts of a house, eatables, things that you'd kind of expect in a primary sort of education. But once you get to that 13th page, it is Doctrine of the Church of England, there on out for 185 pages.
Wow.
Now, that being said, just because that's what the textbooks reflect is not indicative of how the students process that information, right? I mean, you're both teachers. I don't have to tell you that.
And you're using that information, and the
Right.
students are learning, and then they are taking what they've learned and they transfer it back to whomever is occupying their, or we say sort of pod.
Right.
So their family units, those people are having conversations about what they're learning, how they're learning.
Yeah.
They're teaching others within that family unit, within that pod, whether they be blood related or not. All the things that they've just learned from school, which is what we see in the 21st century.
Right, and so that's, I think, for me, the part that I find most compelling about studying this school is that you have what primary documentation says of here are the textbooks, here's what the students were taught, here are the lists of students. But when you actually start to look at the reality of the school, where you're teaching mostly 6 and 7-year-old kids. I mean, some of them are young as 3, some of them are old as 10, but they're kids. How they make meaning is often, from what we see in later documentation, totally antithetical to what the policies of the Bray School were imposing on those children.
And while it's certainly a school that supported slavery,
Yeah.
used the teachings of the Church of England, we don't know how Anne Wager used the material.
No, it's a question we're still trying to figure out the answer to.
And we know she was a skilled teacher.
Yeah.
She may not have let herself be tied to those books. She may have seen some children who needed something else, needed more than the book said they should be doing at that point in time.
Yeah.
We know several of the students as adults still had the skills in terms of skills like literacy, and they could read, they could write. So we know she conveyed a lot of information, but we don't know exactly how she did it and then how it is processed. It was the goal, though, for the students to take the knowledge back, as you said, to the people with whom they're living. But yet, what are they doing with it there, too? So
Right.
it's part of this puzzle, and it's one of the few ways we can get at education for any children in Williamsburg in the 18th century. It's an entry that helps us get at some of the dynamics of this town in a way no other place does.
Right, and I think that also speaks to complexity of curriculum, right? Because so 9 out of 10 of the students were enslaved. So they had a white master or mistress who had control over their body, who decided whether they went to the school or for how long. And then about 10% of the students were free blacks. But the motivations of who is sending an enslaved student versus what the enslaved student is getting versus Ann Wager fitting into that situation based on what politically is going on year to year means that although we have this list of textbooks, the curriculum or what was happening in that classroom could change really drastically, not just year to year, but I would imagine, right, like day to day.
Intrinsic education, when you're talking about a child's motivation to learn.
Yeah.
And as an educator, you can only do so much to transmit that learning to that child. So what you're doing is you're passing on the information, and it's either, as they say, you have the scholar in the tower transmitting the information down onto the child, or you are transmitting back and forth. And you're also thinking about the differentiation of education. So whereas Ann Wager may be doing differentiation in the classroom, whereas somebody's here when they're reading, or somebody's here, and then that student is also going home and having to do differentiation for their family members. So whereas mama's here, baby sister might be here, child is somewhere in the middle, and all of them are just transmitting all of this learning and trying to get to meet everybody where they are, which is one of the hardest parts about education in any century, is really meeting that student at where they are, what they need, and how they best learn.
Yeah.
And I think you touched on this, Nicole, the idea that, there is the Bray School, and oftentimes when we think of education today, we think of going to school, going to class, but it's interesting.
Yeah.
In the OED definition, school is not mentioned at all.
Right.
So can you all speak to the idea of, just the difference between schooling and learning and the education that these children are getting elsewhere from parents or elders? There's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. There's a difference between the brain and the mind. So can you speak to what they're getting from those parents and elders within the community?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, Hope, your point on the definition of education that we used is a really good one. That definition actually is circa about 1531. And the next time the OED changes that definition is in the 1840s.
Wow.
So I think that really speaks.
That says something.
It says something,
Yeah,
right, to
it
the
does.
idea of culturally, when you look at like a Western European American Anglo society, how are they defining education? And it's not necessarily in schools, but it is training for somebody's station, which speaks, I think, a great deal to motivations both behind the school, why somebody maybe wouldn't send an enslaved individual, maybe why a free black parent wouldn't want to send their child, or why they would, right? So you have really in Williamsburg, it's the capital city, right? So it's very, very elite. Ann Wager, for example, could not afford to buy a home here. She rented the whole time. But the people who do own homes here, they're the top 5 to 10% of the wealthy, and you still have tradesmen and tradeswomen running very, very high-level shops. And so within that, for enslaved individuals, you have cooks, laundresses, waiting men, footmen, postilion drivers, hostlers, people in, and I want to qualify this. in what would be defined by their owner as a skilled position. But you also have other types of education across Virginia for those who are Afro-Virginians. I mean, if you're working, we've talked about this, if you're out working in the field and tobacco is a 13-month crop, right?
Yes.
Which is like more months than there are in a year.
Yeah.
I don't know about the three of you sitting on this panel, but I certainly don't know how to do that. Like, that is a very skilled position that literally generates the wealth and the power of Virginia at this point in time. So when we're talking about education, reading, writing, literacy, and literacy, when I'm defining it, I mean, being able to read and write your name, basic monosyllabic words, is definitely apparent at the Bray School, but other forms of education are present, whether you're learning a trade, you are learning or being forced to learn how to process a crop, or learning from your family, right? Like I can't speak to this as a white woman, but like Black community members in Williamsburg and how you learn how to navigate, in this case, although the population of Williamsburg is 52% Black, it is the white population that dominates the legal, social, educative system, right? So that's an education unto itself, too.
Yeah.
I mean, I think whether it is the white man or woman who decided to send a child to the Bray School or the free Black parent, they're trying to get part of what the child needs to fit into the place that society has determined they should fill.
Right.
And I think that's why with the Bray School, some of the elite families of the city send enslaved boys and girls to learn proper manners, to learn etiquette, to learn how to behave in front of other white people
Yeah.
as they're being prepared to be a personal servant to a member of the gentry household. And then you've got tavern keepers like Christiana Campbell and Jane Vobe and Anthony Hay, who tend to send boys
Yeah.
who are going to become the waiting boys and then waiting men inside the taverns. Because again, they, in the owner's mind, need certain skills to fit into the place they're being put. And that's sort of one part of the education. And then there's the home education.
Right.
Although, Debbie, I like the way you put it better, is the other things you learn at home that help you navigate the rest of your life.
Yeah.
But, yeah, you have those conversations
Yeah.
about,
Yeah.
how do I address someone? In our classroom, the first few weeks, it's how do you make a friend? How do you introduce
Yeah.
yourself?
Yeah.
How do you have conversations?
Yeah.
How do you not socially step on someone else's toes?
Yeah.
And then you
Yeah.
get into almost finer points of view. So if Ann Wager's teaching stitchery, fine motor skills, being able to have that,
Yeah.
that smaller grip to be able to work a needle or to work a quill or to
good
work
point.
a hammer. So all
Yeah.
of these things are part of, almost like the practical magic of education.
Yeah.
Whereas you're having these stories of reading, but you're also having this almost like this these information being poured into these children as they're sitting and learning. They're reading, they're writing, they're enjoying each other's company, and they're also learning the social norms, which also helps them to build on their prior knowledge so that when they do finally make it out into wherever they're meant to be, they will have those skills.
And I think that speaks so much, Debbie, what you're talking about sort of with this practical magic of education to the part that for me is at the heart of understanding the Bray School, which is the children.
Yeah.
No matter what master or mistress or free Black parent or the Church of England thought in terms of education, both generally and specifically at the Bray School, first and foremost, we're thinking about, these babies. I mean, they were 6 and 7 years old, and
Being sent to school all day,
Sent to school.
sunrise to
All
sunset,
day.
6 days a week.
yeah, and then expected also to go to Bruton Parish on Sunday.
With Ann Wager.
With Ann Wager. But in addition to that, making meaning in their worlds, that is a form of education, but often I think when we talk about the Bray School is not fully recognized or appreciated, right? So what it makes me think of, one of my favorite students to talk about is Hannah. So Hannah, when she went to the school, she went between 1762, she shows up on that list, and 1765, because Robert Carter Nicholas, who's one of the trustees, complains about her. Yeah. So she was 7 when she went to the school. She left the school when she was 10. And to paraphrase, essentially, he writes to the Bray Associates and said, well, this school is not working the way you intended, because let me tell you, Hannah is not being more obedient. But Hannah is taking that education and forming it for herself. And if you pull apart the primary source, if you almost peel at it, Marissa Fuentes, the historian, says if you read along the bias grain, right? So you take a piece of fabric and you stretch it.
What else is there? Because there's
Right.
always something else there.
Exactly. And I think when we're talking about these students, having been in your classroom with you before, Debbie, it's amazing to see where kids will form their and grow their own education.
And it's for us, it's project-based learning where they are allowed to develop their own thinking. So it's one of those things where you're sitting at a table and you spill your milk and somebody raises their hand and says, what do I do now? Okay, so the first thing you got to do, go get a paper towel. Second thing you got to do is you got to go throw your paper towel in the trash. Third thing you have to do is you have to come back and you have to sit down and make sure the rest of your breakfast trash is cleared away. And all of these simple steps in trying to get them to think. And people always laugh at me when we talk about the fact that, if you've noticed, I am very hoarse because I have spent the past week going, okay, so when you have to finish your breakfast, you are going to put on your mask, you're going to stand up, you're going to push in your chair, you're going to go to the trash can, and you're going to go back to your table. And you say this all day because we're trying to get them to a point to where, okay, those basic things are down. And so then what they do is they're going to learn it, and then they're going to change the lyric on how they're going to do it. So they learn the basic strand of what they need to do, and then they learn how to do it the way that best suits them. And I think that's what Hannah does. When she leaves the Bray School, everything that she needs, she got, and she took it with her. And folks are very, and I have parents that are very much like, I think one of my parents was like, I didn't teach him that. They run around going, I believe in you, you can do that. Where did they get that from? And I'm like, you know, they get it from me because that's what we say. That's part of our classroom. That's what we say. And they take that with them, and then they teach it to other students.
And I think that's what makes, for me, the Bray School relevant. Obviously, the students and how they were being instructed in a pro-slavery school is not in any way equatable to what you're doing in your classroom with empowering your kids. But kids are kids throughout. People are people. And so when you look at these children, not just as statistics, but as children and people with thoughts and feelings and how they're connecting to the world, I think that really gets into this question of how do people perceive education? You have to look at not just systems of power, but these individuals themselves.
And I think a lot of people are kind of surprised by the Bray School because there is the thought that education in the form of literacy is illegal. So can you speak to that? I'll let you finish, Julie, but can you all speak to kind of that notion, you know, that it's not illegal at all, and what some of the legalities are around that?
It's not illegal at all in 18th century Virginia to teach an enslaved or free black child to read. Apprenticeship agreements for enslaved children and free children of color often specify, you know, in addition to being taught the art and mystery of the skill of the trade, you learn reading, writing, and arithmetic with the goal of being able to keep your own account book and run your own business once you have gained the skill. So this literacy, being able to read, opens doors. And I think Hannah was not the only student of Ann Wager's who found herself in Williamsburg. This is the capital of Virginia. There are printing presses here. There are words everywhere through this city that once you have that key of reading, you can read all of the stuff going on. And you can make of it what you want. So you can understand that there are problems between your colony and England. You can read that the white men think they are being enslaved by Great Britain. And any person of color can legally learn to read if they have the opportunity. And again, figuring out where there might be a loophole in this institutional slavery is not what they're supposed to be doing, but it's there. The
And
tool is there.
You're absolutely right. And I
Yeah.
think this feeds into your question of, well, then when did reading
Yeah.
and writing, because I often get that question, well, when did
Yeah.
it become illegal? And I think rather than just looking at dates and time, we have to look at how students like Hannah
Yeah.
literally impacted the change of legislation.
Mm-hmm.
So up until up until 1831, it was not illegal to
yeah.
teach any person of color, free or enslaved, how to read or write. And when I say person of color, I'm qualifying it as the laws qualified it in the 18th century. Negro, which is a term that they used for those who were of African descent or Afro-Virginian descent. Mulatto, which means someone who's mixed race, could be white and black or white and indigenous, or et cetera. And then Indian, and that of course speaks to different native tribes, both sovereign and tributary in the area. So why is that the case? Well, some of it actually feeds into, I feel from the research I've done, the British Enlightenment. So when you have British philosophers like David Hume saying, well, you can't educate a black in the same way as you can a white. And he writes about this pretty extensively. And we live in a society that's full of hierarchy. A lot of people don't want to challenge their betters, these elite in this Enlightenment system, as well as generally in society. And you also haven't had any schools run by Anglo-Virginians at this point for black students. So everybody, I think, who's in charge of the administration has very specific ideas of how the school will run, right? And then you get the Bray School, but the kids are all very little. You know, they're 6, they're 7, they're not adults. And then the American Revolution hits. And it's not just a revolution of politics, it's a revolution of society, it's a revolution of religion. You know, all of a sudden you have a collapsing of the established church who wielded power and policy on how education would happen, not just in Virginia, but most of the southern colonies. And when that collapses, and all of a sudden Baptists and Presbyterians and Moravians and Swedenborgians, and the list goes on, it's very extensive, sharing all these different ideas on religion and education, well, all of a sudden, people are using the Bible as well as all these other tools of writing, especially in the heart of Williamsburg, to shape and reshape the world around them. And the Church of England said, whoa, wait a minute, no, we never intended the education to do that. Nor did a lot of the legislators who were coming from that world. And so the way I've always worded it is, you cannot get rid of what they would describe as the infection of religious ideas that have spread. You can't get rid of that, it's too late. But you can get rid of the symptom, which is the opportunity to read. Now that being said, like you said, there are always legal loopholes.
Yeah.
Because even though they ban reading and writing in 1831, technically a slave owner can do whatever they want with their personal property. So if they choose to teach reading or writing, like Frederick Douglass's slave owners, people can't stop them. So it's a very complicated question, but I think a very interesting one in relation to the Bray School.
All right, now that we've heard a little bit about the Bray School from our panel, we have a question from our audience. This is a question from Aaron. Thank you for your question, Aaron. Aaron would like to know, were there any schools where white and black students attended class together, or maybe if not schools as we think of formal, maybe were there any circumstances that you know of?
So this is a really good question. I do have an answer for it, but I know I have been talking a lot, so I want to make sure. Do either one of you want to respond to this question first?
I know out in the rural areas after the revolution, there are going to be spaces and places where African American children and children of European descent are going to be learning together. And a lot of it doesn't have to be a formal educational facility. It's just nature. There's these great stories about how the races are intermingling and people are intermarrying and having these conversations about what everyone is teaching everyone else. It's one of the reasons also why we have almost like a shared storytelling culture, because this information is being passed through that oral tradition. The children are being taught literally just sitting together and learning, and in these further out communities out in the frontier where you're not going to be able to find a school teacher. you have moms or you have dads or you have people just getting together and talking to these students and teaching them again practical skills, things that they can use in order to survive.
Well, I can think of two instances, both involving Mrs. Wager in one way or the
Yeah.
other. Initially, when Ann Wager started at the Brace School, she still had some white students for whom she was being paid to teach.
Yeah.
And the letter doesn't tell us whether she was teaching them in the same space at the same time,
Right.
or whether she might set one group of students off on lessons and change her location.
Right,
Again,
exactly.
we don't know that yet, but the trustees were not happy about that. And they told her she could pick one of her groups of pupils. She could not teach both.
You're
So
absolutely right.
is it because they were physically together in that same space, which having been in the 18th century portion of the Bray Diggs house,
Yeah.
it would have been even tighter than her
Right.
30 children that we know attended the Bray School, or whether they felt she couldn't divide her attention equitably. That we don't know, but
Right.
they did not want her pursuing two groups of students, and she chose the Bray School.
Yeah.
Which
Simil-
tells us, reading against the grain, a little bit about Ann Wager.
It absolutely does. And reading against the grain, you can also make a potential supposition of, does this have to do with segregation in terms of students and
Right.
schools, and that it's so segregated
Yeah.
in the capital city where legislation is visible. Like you are watching people walk in and out of the Capitol building making
And you can see the
legislation.
printers as they print the legislation,
Right,
too.
exactly. So we don't even want one teacher teaching two different races of students.
Right.
The interesting thing about that, too, is that the Bray Associates are very clear. They want these schools only for children who are of African descent,
Yeah.
and several people who they correspond with, because the Bray Associates actually tried to set up lots of different schools across not just North America, but Virginia. They tried to establish schools in Yorktown, Norfolk, Caroline County, Orange County, and the city of Fredericksburg. And some of their correspondents say, well, we'd really love libraries for white students, or we'd really love a school for white students, but we don't want this school.
Yeah.
So it's interesting when you look at formal schools, those are segregated. But informal, and by informal,
Yeah.
I'm speaking of trade shops,
Right.
daily human interactions. I mean, account keeping at a market, right? Even Frederick Douglass, he writes
Yeah.
about this in his narrative about how he'll encounter little white children in Baltimore,
Right.
and he says basically, I convince them to teach me how to spell because I say, well, can you spell this word? And they say, yeah. He said, I don't believe you. Show me. Right? Obviously, they're interacting.
Right.
And so, yes, but with the Bray School, no.
Yeah.
Yes.
But
Yes.
the force of Ann Wager's, I really do believe the force of Ann Wager's personality and her dedication to their education, why it didn't work in other spaces, is
Yeah.
that you have to have an educator who is, regardless of whether or not we know her motivation, she was motivated to keep this school running and moving forward.
Yeah.
You have all this documentation about her asking for books and asking for money
Yeah.
and asking for these things to help keep her school
going, yeah.
running and keep the school going. And it's kind of like the 18th century choice of, well, we have today donors choose, where we ask, hey, I need help with
Yeah.
books, this, that, and the
Yeah,
other.
and it's so interesting for me because in understanding the students and understanding Ann Wager to the best that we can with the information we currently have, it makes the story very messy. Because on the one hand, you have this woman who is willing to give up teaching white children to teach those of African descent, but is 100% teaching pro-slavery ideology. So the belief that their souls would be equal but their bodies are not is a very ugly
Yeah.
contradiction.
And
but
it's really control.
yeah, it is.
I mean,
Absolutely.
you're opening their minds, but yet trying to control
their
what they
bodies.
can do with their bodies and to
Yeah.
keep them in their place
Right.
physically in society.
And I think it's such, when you get into, for me, in portraying Ann Wager and doing all of this research, I'm talking about the connection between women's history, religion, slavery, and education. And it's fraught and messy and uncomfortable. And I think that's what makes talking about the Bray School so compelling, not just from Anne, but from the perspective of the students, because history is messy and compelling.
Life is messy and compelling.
Yeah, I mean,
And so often museums don't have good ways of getting at the kids and what their experiences were. This gives Colonial Williamsburg an entry into part of childhood in this city.
and to talk about those children with respect,
Yeah.
to say their
Absolutely.
names and to
Yes.
acknowledge them for being people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We have a question from Joseph, and I believe we've answered the first part of the question about whether the enslaved were educated for their own benefit or that of their masters. But the second part of Joseph's question leads us into our next segment as we're moving ahead. Did that change over time? And the question is also, how did education shift for students moving into the 19th century, emancipation, and then after emancipation?
So when you look at, and there's a really great book if you're interested, it's written by a man with the last name Anderson that's called Education for Black Students in the South. And it looks specifically at pretty much emancipation till about the 1930s, 1940s, you know, height of the Jim Crow era, before Brown v. Board of Education. So when you look at the 19th century, right, so we've talked about how there's a restricting of legal access to literacy. And then when emancipation happens, really it's the Freedmen's Bureau and a lot of those ex-slaves who have self-emancipated or are now legally recognized as free, who are leading the charge for those black schools that are mostly coming out of Baptist and Presbyterian and other sort of religious schools, or there's a connection between both of them. Eventually, and this is very interesting, is that in the hopes to get power, control, and align the ideology of education, you have a lot of northern industrialists start funneling money into the colonial South to try to gain control over these schools away from the Freedmen's Bureau, which leads to this competition of white administration versus black administration, or losing black administrative power for white administrative power through the Jim Crow era. I'm wondering, though, if you guys want to speak more on that.
When you start towards the end of the 1800s, then you also see, and I know Julie will probably speak better on this than I can, about the Lost Cause movement. And for me, when we're thinking about the Lost Cause movement, think about the fact that women can't vote, women can't hold office, women don't have any political machinery that they can operate on their own. Yet you see these Southern women watching these gentlemen of the Confederacy pass away, and they start really panicking because they're like, oh my gosh, here goes this really huge part of our history as we see it, as we believe it. So they put all their power into, and you know, one of the things that we talk about is the colonial revival and the Lost Cause movement, as well as a reaction to immigration, is really what fuels this next step in education, which is the building of textbooks with specific agenda and school activities. So you have these children who are doing pageants for the Lost Cause. We have children who are actually participating in Klan pageants at the age of 5 or 6 years old, because there is this fear of that, of a different history being taught, of that Northern history being put down upon Southerners who feel that their cause was a just one and a righteous one, and they should not lose the momentum or the history of that cause.
Yeah, so you have these white Southern women who are influencing how education is shaped, and inevitably that influences not just black students, but black administrations and the perception of those schools, as well as what they have access to or where they feel safe.
Yeah, and the Lost Cause can influence Southern schools because the public school movement is not uniform across the country.
That's a really good point.
Virginia doesn't have a systematic approach to public schools until 1870. There are pieces of it. But then if you think of like the Northwest ordinances that establish how Americans are going to move into the land gained after the Revolution, it's the Land Ordinance of 1785 that reserves a lot out of each township for a public school.
Yeah.
And that becomes something that each township starts to control. So there's a range of approaches to public education in the late 18th, early 19th century, 20th century, and still today.
Yeah.
And that allows the local areas to adopt what they want to tell in terms of history. What story do you want to tell? How are you going to elevate pieces of your past? And the United Daughters of the Confederacy were very influential
Especially
in the
in
South,
Virginia.
writing their own textbooks, supporting the monuments, and that you can find that approach, a local approach to what a group wants to have taught in many places across the country, not only in the South.
Right. So you have this interplay between schools that are designed for white children and what they're generating in terms of textbooks, money,
Yeah.
funds, and then you have a lot of Black schools that are being supported by the Black communities that are surrounding them to just get them up and going.
Right.
And there's this conflict, there's this tension between all of them in what's eventually going to be forming into the public schools as we understand it as a concept, right?
Museums also are serving as a place of public education.
Right.
Yes, this is a
So
good
you
point.
see the formation of the Jamestown Foundation,
Mm-hmm.
Mount Vernon, Monticello, the preservation of the beliefs of the founding fathers
Right.
and those
Yeah.
American concepts that are supposed to only appeal to a certain type of person.
Mm-hmm.
So you're almost seeing like the museums and schools growing together. During
Yeah, they
that
do,
same
they
time.
do
Yeah.
support each other in the approach of thinking about an American past and
Yeah.
highlighting the founding fathers, the key political moments in our country's history.
That's a great point.
And before we get too far ahead, just a point of clarification. Ann Wager was a white woman
Yes.
who taught these students. So Nicole Brown, she is her portrayer.
Right.
But what you also see happening in the 19th century is, Nicole, you did mention
Yeah.
these historically Black colleges and universities. And a lot of them came into existence after the end of the Civil War, where now you do have,
Right.
Black
Yeah.
professors,
Right.
Black men and women. Can we speak a little to that?
Yeah, and in fact, the Bray Associates, with some of the new research I've been doing, show that exact trend. It's really exciting that you see all of these Black loyalists. So Black loyalists fought with the British during the American Revolution. A lot of them emigrate to Nova Scotia in Canada or to the Caribbean. And most of the Bray schools that show up after the Revolution are all run by Black loyalists, and in some cases, in the school in particular in Nassau in the Bahamas, it was started by a Black loyalist who was either from South Carolina or New York. His name is William Joseph. And eventually his sons take over, and then eventually one of their students takes over, who was taught at that school. So you see, one of the big shifts I think that you see from the Revolution to the 19th century is more Black administration and Black control over schools, which is really important for for these students to see themselves in that administration. And then as we move past the Freedmen's Bureau, right, so you've had the emancipation, you start to see all of these administrators start to lose control of their schools because of other sort of white factors coming in, and there's this constant fight between that, right? So you
Yes.
bring up HBCUs and the predecessors to those, which were actually, ironically, Bray schools.
And these conversations are still going on right now because
Yeah.
folks are now saying, oh, these historically Black universities, they're not getting the funding that they need. And it's because in the late 1800s, early 1900s, these schools are being squeezed out so that the other schools who are for predominantly white males are getting the money that these other colleges need. So these African American schools have to figure out how they're going to survive, how they're going to continue to grow. And as you're looking across America and looking at the growth of education, you're starting to see more of those disparities between those higher levels of socioeconomic development and the lower levels, with African Americans really struggling if they are in a good place where they can take care of their own children and they can educate them, and everyone there is prosperous within a few years of establishing again, we go to Tulsa, establishing a place where you can put your foot down and say, this is where we make our stand. And then it just seems like every time that happens, those opportunities are destroyed, and setting education reform for African American children back several more years.
Yeah.
We'd like to remind you that we're talking a lot about education, history, slavery, how all of that's taught. So just keep sending your questions so we can have a chance to ask. Now, different people had different motivations for what was taught in the 18th century, and different people have different motivations for what we teach today.
Yeah.
What connects the students of the 21st century to the students of the 18th century? And if we can start with you, Debbie.
It's going to be the passion for learning, and the fact that as teachers, it's our responsibility to encourage them to grow and to learn, and also, again, we talk about meeting them where they are. We spend a lot of time watching people have these really frank discussions about teachers lately. And it's been difficult to go back into that classroom environment, because I have friends in social media that say, okay, so I know 3 months of vacation, whoop whoop, and then you're not teaching, teaching face-to-face either. So obviously you have nothing going on in your life that is going to be stressful for you. And you're sitting there going, we're using the most basic tools that we have to teach the most complex things that these kids need to learn. And it's going to be the same thing in the 18th century. You have these very, very basic tools, but these complex concepts these students need to learn, number one. And number two, it's every child comes to your doorstep with different goals, different motivations, different ideas about themselves and the world around them, and how education is either going to benefit them or hinder them.
Yeah.
And then there are very few in the middle who are just kind of like, I'm here, I guess I'll do this. And it's what makes teaching at any generation, whether we're in the 18th century or we're in the 21st century, that's what makes it challenging. When you step into a classroom in the morning and the first thing that you do, you hit the floor running, and all these kids are coming in at you, and you're going, hey, hello, pick that up, put your mask on, don't do that, please do this, do this, do this, do this, do this, and trying to make sure that you're keeping them motivated. And I'm always, when I'm in my classroom, especially early in the morning, I'm always thinking about, really, it's really funny now because I worked for Colonial Williamsburg for such a long time. I kind of reflect back on the Bray School, and I think about those kids, and I think about the things that they've learned, and I think about the foundation that those children in their education have laid for my kids who are learning, my little students now who are going in, they're 6, 7, 8 years old, and I'm trying to do the best that I can with what I have. And you just have these students who were doing the best they can with what they got during that time period.
Yeah.
Now, in some states, we are seeing laws actually being proposed now that explicitly exclude some content from what is being taught in the classroom. According to Education Week, as of August 26 of this year, 27 states have introduced bills or made other restrictions on teaching critical race theory or even discussing racism and sexism in class. And 12 states have actually carried out these bans. I'd like to ask you all a question about that, but first I feel like we should start with the working definition of critical race theory, because a lot of people hear it and have no idea of what it actually is. So critical race theory is a legal framework developed at Harvard Law School in the 1980s by Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Richard Delgado, among others. This theory posits that racism is not just a product of individual bias, but is embedded in legal systems and policies. So with that in mind, how is this going to impact learning in different places? And also, Should critical race theory be something that's taught in K through 12?
We are already teaching the tenets of diversity in schools, where people discuss critical race theory and they don't understand that it's a college course.
Yeah.
You know, number one, we start on that. Number two, in my classroom, 90% of the literature that is presented to my students does not adequately reflect their diversity as children in their own space. So when we talk about teaching inclusion, diversity, equity, making sure that these children have the opportunity to be represented. For me, when we're teaching, we are teaching, number one, that we are all part of a larger community. It starts at home, then school, then the community at large, and then the world community. And as part of that community, these students have to learn that there are so many different facets to this world. Different religions, musics, art. There's so much diversity. And where I find having these conversations with parents and even with colleagues, where I had a colleague confront me saying, well, I know that you're one of those people that's probably supporting critical race theory, even in a kindergarten classroom. I'm like, no, because that's a college course. Yeah. First, let's go back to that. Second, in my kindergarten classroom, I am letting my students know that there are inequities in this world. They have to understand that. In order to understand who they are, where they are, and how America got to where it is today, they have to understand the inequities inherent in the systems of education, of law, everywhere that we go. And so we have to teach those systems. We have to have the children understand that because of these inequities, there's a lot of things going on that makes life harder.
Right.
So what are you going to do as a student, as a human being, to make things better? And that's the flip side of it is that it's public action. You're teaching your students, I'm teaching my students public action to be able to stand up for the rights of everyone who occupies a classroom space with them. It doesn't matter what they are, what they represent. We're standing up and representing those things.
Right.
And if somebody wants to put the label critical race theory on it, my mother always said, if you don't understand what the term is, please don't use it.
And I think you bring up a really great point, not only on teaching children to engage in ways that seek equity, not just equality, but equity for everyone, is actually the second sort of tenet of critical race theory, which is realistically being a good citizen. But you're right, when you're talking about critical race theory, the first time I was introduced to it is on a graduate level. It is a complex legal theoretical framework that is not being taught in K through 12. But the idea of teaching about equity, that I think is sometimes, from what I've observed, and this is just my own personal experience, where people bristle because it means that you have to dive into the deep and get really uncomfortable with facets of our past, both the wonderful parts of it and the very ugly parts of it.
Yeah.
But at its core, I think that's why for me teaching about the Bray School is important for that reason.
Yeah, and I don't teach a class called critical race theory to
Right.
high school students who join us in the summer or to undergraduates, but my teaching is informed by the messiness of the past.
Right.
As if I didn't acknowledge the messiness of the past and the lack of inclusion, the lack of equity, I'm not being honest to my sources. And I'm actually lying to my students.
Right.
And I'm teaching them to perpetuate a lie. Instead, I want to show 16-year-olds and early 20s the messiness at the level they're ready for engagement.
Yes.
And Colonial Williamsburg is a wonderful place to do it because you can be interdisciplinary too. And it's not that makes it less messy, but you get different pieces of the past so you can physically see the inequity in housing. You can physically see the inequity in the artifacts the archaeologists excavate. And I can't imagine, and thankfully I don't have to, having limits on what I can teach. Because when you put the limit on the teacher, you limit the opportunity for students to find that spark. I mean, I have absolutely adored sitting with high school kids who put the pieces together and they go, oh, that's why
That's what
this
that
has
is.
happened. Because of, and you just see, the proverbial light bulb goes on, and just I do not want to lie as a teacher, and I don't want to do a disservice by withholding uncomfortable or messy, because
Right.
that's where you actually think, is with the messiness.
Exactly,
I
exactly. And
absolutely agree.
ladies, can you believe we are almost at the end of our time?
Wow, I thought we got to
we
talk
have
longer.
about 5 minutes or so, but before we finish, we've talked a lot about how individual personalities can influence a school as much as it does a curriculum.
Yeah.
So that means everyone watching this program today has the power to shape education. I'd like to get a final quick thought from each of you. What is an action that every person in our audience can do today to influence education in their community?
I would say, first and foremost, be involved, not just on a national level or an international level, but on a local level. Know what is going on in your local schools. Even if you don't have kids, I don't have kids, but that doesn't mean that I don't care about the children in my community, and understanding how education currently is impacting them, both equitably and inequitably. And then understand your past and understand the messiness of it. Come to Colonial Williamsburg. Come talk to me. Because if you can understand how one event in time in the 18th century is connected to what is going on right now today, they're linked like a chain. And we are here to talk to you, and we are here to talk through things with you.
Educate yourselves, educate your children, educate your community. Keep teaching, keep learning, because if we're not learning, if we're not teaching, we're not growing.
Yeah.
I'm going to echo what my wonderful co-panelists have said. Become involved. I am the parent of 3 daughters, now young women who've graduated from high school. I did not attend a school board meeting until I could do so via Zoom. I wish I had listened years before. It gives you the context for things that happen at your child's school, and even some cases in particular classrooms. So educate yourself. You can go online for your state's Board of Education. You can find out the curriculum that should be taught in schools. You could find out how things are decided. The tools are there.
Yeah.
Educate yourself, be involved. And then to, again, highlight Colonial Williamsburg. Come here, learn how to investigate the past, see how the Bray School and other pieces of this 18th century city shape us today.
Yeah.
And when you learn how to pick apart the past here, you can take that skill home and pick apart your hometown's past and deepen your connection to different places in time and broaden your understanding of where we are now and why a diverse, complicated, messy education is essential.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nicole, Deborah, and Julie. Thank you, everyone who is watching in our audience today. We hope that this talk has inspired you to think about education, how we teach history, and how you can get involved in education in your own community. We'd also like to thank our donors, especially Mark and Iris Koblitz, who make the Us, Past, Present, and Future panels possible. We ask that you join us again next month on October 16th, when we'll talk to Jamie Boskett, President and CEO of the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, Christy Coleman, Executive Director of the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation, and Cliff Fleet, President and CEO of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. They'll be talking about how history organizations are preparing for the upcoming 250th anniversary of the United States declaring independence. I'm Hope Wright, and it's been my pleasure to join you all today. And I believe we are able to share the 88 names of the hundreds of students that did attend the Bray School that we know with you as we close. Thank you. Have a wonderful afternoon.